When I rang the doorbell in the summer of 2000, a plump man in his 70s answered. He looked similar to Rodney Dangerfield, especially in the nose. We have never met before, and I wasn't certain if my friend, who had initially invited me, informed him about my arrival. The writers' meeting was supposed to start at 7:30 p.m. every Thursday. It had been a ritual for nearly a decade. He tilted a half smile anyway, eyes beaming at a pretty girl, and invited me in. His white t-shirt and dark crinkly slacks was not the style I had envisioned. Also, it was evident he needed a haircut because the length reached over his ears. I had envisioned a distinguished beard or pipe, or even a brown sweater with leather patches at the elbows. After all, wasn't that a standard for aging writers? I followed him into the dining room, a short distance from the front door. He had a slight limp, which I later learned about his club foot, one of the many difficulties he overcame in his long life. In the middle of the room stretched a lengthy table. He sat at the head of it, and I was amazed to see his walls camouflaged in replicated paintings from top to bottom, like an incomplete Rubik's Cube. Picasso was the only one I had recognized, much to my ignorance at the time. Another wall supported shelves and shelves of books. The mismatched coloring of the book covers mirrored Picasso's wild designs. In a corner, a baby grand piano faced a large window opposite from the fireplace. Leonard had been famous in his time. He had been a published writer since the 1950s and knew other legendary authors like Mario Puzo, Joseph Heller, Thomas Berger, and James T. Farrell. He left a trail of other writing groups from coast to coast. I didn't know what to expect from him, whether he would be harsh or boring, arrogant or humble. After all, I sat in his dining room instead of a classroom, and yet only a fragment of people in my Kansas hometown knew about his presence. He used to write for my local newspaper, the Manhattan Mercury, but since then, he was forgotten as if a misplaced trophy inside a crowded closet. My hometown took him for granted, not appreciating an accomplished writer who dwelled among us. As Leonard chatted about the hot weather, his fat dog, a cocker spaniel with a lovable personality, wobbled into the room. I began stroking the panting hairy pet. "That's Muggsy, abbreviation for an overweight sausage," Leonard joked, speaking with a Jewish New York accent. "You think he looks like one? Yeah? He wouldn't look like one if I didn't look like one. That's the problem." I liked him without delay. Despite his rough exterior, pitted face, and thick fingers, he had a simple humor about him. During the 2 years I knew Leonard, I learned of the obstacles and misfortunes he underwent to gain his success. He emerged out of the ghetto, far from a modest origin, unlike mine. It was at that point I realized writing could be a means of survival. His beginnings weren't as graceful as mine, to say in the least. Leonard Bishop, born October 17, 1922, grew up in New York City in severe poverty. His father, Edward, was a criminal, heroin addict, and wife-beater who exhausted time in every prison in the state of New York and parts of New Jersey. Once, Leonard and his older brother, Bernard, spent a year in a Catholic orphanage because, while his father stooped in jail, his mother, Esther, had no other means to feed or clothe her children. He told a story of sitting in a long tin bathtub with 10 or 15 other children as the nuns splashed scalding hot water over their heads and then scrubbed their fingers with wire brushes. In addition to, he was born with a club foot and dyslexia. His nickname was Feets. Often, teachers branded him as either lazy or stupid, and often he sat in a corner with a pointed dunce hat. At one point in his young life, he became a hobo and traveled all over the country on trains. It would seem fate had dismissed his life at the bottom of a bucket. Yet, ironically, it was a hobo woman who gave Leonard a thick book she carried in her tattered bag and taught him to read. This woman, whom he'd forgotten her name, but the title, though just, inspired him to achieve more in his life. That, and feeling jinxed. He had nearly been killed on a few occasions, details he never spoke of. "If you believe in luck," he argued, "you know she's an ill-dispositioned lover." So, he returned home and enrolled in college, the New School of Social Research. Leonard attended a creative writing class, along with other people like Mario Puzo. Feeling intimidated by them because they were better educated, he wrote anyway. "I wanted to write, to slam the words on paper and make them scream. One word would start it, a word ripped out of my guts to start the pool of blood, then fill it up with tissue and vein and muscle and thought, then give it to people and let them see a man." One professor, Dr. Glicksberg, who didn't judge his writing strictly as obscene, detected a gift. With a limited vocabulary, Leonard wrote simply and wrote with aggressive realism, repeatedly using foul language. His professor used a series of asterisks in replacement of the obscenities when he passed other copies to the class. In his introduction from his book, Dare to be a Great Writer, he noted, the instructor said, "Crude, yes. You might even say they, your characters, were ill-mannered and vulgar, but they stink with power." It was the dynamic that came from the Great Depression starvation and the scrabble to stay alive. The other students wanted to hear what I wrote. In one of his short stories, Grass, Milk, and Children, an account about children of the slums, he wrote, "When I was 4 years old, I spoke to God. I begged him to pay rent for us. It was cold and dirty sleeping in the street, but God put his oily tongue in his fat cheek and watched me. When I cried, he didn't dry my tears, and I knew that God was a lie. God is the cold and the dirt and the cement and the shadows and the rains. God is a dirty cellar without music." The bitter tones that repeatedly excelled in his writings likewise excelled in compassion. The word that replaces hate is humanity, a voice that tells humanity, living until the skin of your soul is filled to the last pore, until every sift and sound and touch and smell and taste open its arms and pulls you in to be alive. That is holy, that is sacred. The second time I arrived for class, I again spent a few moments alone with Leonard before the others would materialize. I enjoyed the personal attention. His kindness and wisdom made me feel unique. He had a special gift for that. Reaching for his bookcase, he removed one that he had written, Dare to be a Great Writer, 329 Keys to Powerful Fiction. Handing it to me, he humorously said, "This isn't a bad book. You might want to consider it for future references." In the chapters, which are outlined like a study guide, a list of don'ts appear in the back. Don't fear the novel size. Don't postpone your novel. Don't marry another writer. And my favorite, don't quit your day job. There is no particular order of his book, and the convenience is comparable to a recipe album. If there is something you need offhand, rather than reading an entire chapter to seek advice, you search the index for development of characters, dialogue, flashbacks, and so forth, then that specific element under that listing. "Why do you want to write?" he once asked me. I shrugged and replied, "Because I just do." I felt silly with that answer. It offered no illumination to the meaning of life, as writers are supposed to inherit, or so I've read. But above all, it felt more of a childish response compared to his life experiences. Leonard lifted his brows and proceeded, "You don't even have to be a talented writer to write. Did you know that? You just need the will to write. The more you do it, the better you become." He beamed a cocky smile. "Now that's good advice. You better write it down." 3 months into his classes, and after a harsh disagreement with another professor, he left college. Of course, his departure didn't stop him from writing. With the help from Dr. Glicksberg, Leonard entered a writer's contest and won $500. It was a proud day. That same day, he received a phone call from Bernard, his brother. Their father had been pacing in an apartment's hallway with a loaded gun, waiting for their mother to return home. When Leonard arrived at the top of the staircase, his chuck still stashed in his coat's pocket, he watched his father pace like a rabid dog, high on heroin. Leonard's anger overwhelmed him. He lunged for his father, punching him until his father bled and whimpered. Bernard pulled him away and slammed him against the wall, telling him the importance of Jewish traditions, that sons should never hit their fathers despite the numerous times that their father had hit them. "I was deeply shocked," Leonard wrote, "not because he, my father, was trying to kill my mother, he had tried it several times before, but because I could see myself 10 years from now, standing inside my father's skin. I was against the wall, clawing for an opening to hide in. I could hear the shovels of hell clattering at me, feel the opened oven searing my soul, and I was terrified. It was then I decided to use my typewriter to become an author." 2 years later, in 1952, he published his first novel, Down All Your Streets. The writing contest caught the attention of Dial Press and offered him a contract. He saw opportunity. "I was a dummy, but I was not stupid." He continued to write about his life experiences, about violence, poverty, drug addiction, lost loves. Shortly after his publication, he ran into a childhood classmate while on the subway. "Feets! Hey, Feets!" his classmate cried out. "You're not gonna believe this. There's some guy using your name on a book. Maybe you ought to sue the guy and get some money, huh?" Leonard didn't tell his former classmate that the guy was really him. He laughed it off as if it were a coincidence. For a man who grew up in a tough environment, to admit he was a writer would be as if admitting he were weak, a sissy, or even a homosexual. Despite the stereotypes, his career catapulted him out from the ghetto. The confidence that followed slowly transformed into teaching. He started at Columbia University in the mid-50s. He never finished college, but his gift superseded his academic credentials. Working with James T. Farrell as part of team teaching, Leonard learned the skills of a teacher as well as a writer. Farrell, who was best known for his Studs Logan trilogy, taught the value of naturalism. Raised in poverty himself in Chicago, Farrell and Leonard developed a strong admiration and friendship, no matter how heated their arguments became at times. Their friendship lasted for 20 years until Farrell's death. Leonard's style of writing was recognized by the gold medal author in the early 60s. Twice, Making My Bed in Hell and The Desire Years dealt with youth and misery. His voice differed greatly from Fitzgerald, Hemingway, and Steinbeck. His tone erupted during a period when American culture began seeking for radical impulses. It was fresh like that of Pollock and disturbing like that of Picasso. It entertained and shocked just like The Blackboard Jungle, Rebel Without a Cause, and The Wild One. His need to write in cafeterias at night inspired him because people of all lifestyles crawled out of their hiding places, and he liked the darkness. Not only that, but he confessed, "If I didn't write in cafeterias, how else would people know I'm a writer? I don't look like one. I look like an overfed butcher." In the late 60s, his career shifted to the West Coast when one of his books, Against Heaven's Hand, was to be made into a movie. The producers changed the title to Seven in Darkness. It sounded more compelling.
Passengers giving you any trouble?
No, not really. If anyone else were being tossed around like this, I'd have my hands full, but they just sit there. It's kind of creepy.
Granted, the movie was designed for television, but Leonard stuck around in California anyway and re-established his friendship with Mario Puzo. In that sunny state, he found several teaching jobs, ranging from University of San Francisco, Haywood, and his last stop, Berkeley. At Berkeley, he taught Anne Rice, Donna Gillespie, Donna Levin, Katherine Endicott, and Carolyn Doty, a new breed of writers. He was also one out of 7 writing teachers whose name resided in Who's Who of American authors. During the early 80s, he married his second wife, Celia, and followed her to her home state of Kansas. He continued teaching private groups until his death in late December of 2002. After 30 years of achieving a distinguished legacy, he finally felt satisfied with his life. "I was no longer a low bum, a hobo, a loser," he wrote. "I had faced the challenge of opportunity and dared to claim it for my life. Hey God, look at me. I'm going to live. I'm an author. I was an author. I would dare to become a great writer. You get what you dare, baby. And if you want it big, you dare big." By the end of 2000, I knew I found a teacher who could tutor my meek abilities as a writer and advance my own voice. Granted, the entire process actually took 2 years before I understood much of what he advised. About prose, about creating your characters into human beings, about locating stiffness in your writing and bending it to flow smoothly. Writing is not easy, nor is it natural. It takes stubbornness and the sensibility to endure criticism, to improve and keep improving. Out of all the lessons I had learned, Leonard emphasized on the misconceptions of inspiration and writer's block, that in order to write well, one must have divine inspiration. And if one lacks inspiration, then it must be writer's block. He stressed on motivation instead of inspiration. He claimed that many of the problems that writers have do not arise from what they cannot do in writing, but what they do not realize a writer must experience if he is to survive society and himself. This experience is just not based from one's personal history, but also built from one's training in writing. The more years an author gathers onto his or her pages, the skill flourishes into art. After 2 years working with Leonard and his Thursday night writers group, he gave me the best compliment I had yet welcomed. He told me, as he pointed his finger, "You no longer have the privilege of being lazy." Leonard finished an unpublished sequel to Dare to be a Great Writer that same year, titled To Hell with Talent. Taking his ideology and extending it like sprouting tree branches, his goal continued to expose the myths about writing and even writers, that only talented people can become writers. As in his first book, his bluntness has defied many traditional stereotypes. The fact is, an author has complete control over his or her characters, that most authors have little, if any, social skills, that anyone with ambition and years of patience can become writers. In his preference to dare, he wrote, "I have not diluted or compromised any of what I know and believed should be written about writing. I have avoided the fluff and cutie pie meanderings that are useless to inexperienced writers." During the autumn of 2002, Leonard was diagnosed with lung cancer. With both radiation and chemotherapy, even at moderate doses, it still forced his immune system to greatly weaken when he caught pneumonia. Within days, he died. It was a shock, just months after his birthday. Even at the age of 80, his bull-like build and determination seemed to guarantee at least another decade. He had such an energetic and witty presence, it seemed absurd to foresee his mortality. He was a Parthenon, with a New Yorkian flair, of course. "You can't do that," he used to joke. "No, you can't say it's in the next chapter. If you do, it's $1 in the jar, baby." The philosophy behind it ensured its symbolic awareness towards students' excuses. Whenever something would be missing, usually an important piece of information to explain the story, or when a scene dragged and needed excitement to keep up a reader's interest, often students, myself included, exclaimed that it would be coming soon. Leonard's point being that it should be in the chapter now. His writing groups still exist in New York, in California, and yes, Toto, even in Kansas. The University of Boston dedicated a section with Leonard's books, notes, film, and tape recordings in his library. To let these groups die would seem insulting. For decades, he worked hard to teach effective techniques. If we were smart, we listened, and hopefully to restore his wisdom. He cared so much about writing that there was a period in my life I could no longer pay the modest fee of $25. He told me not to worry about it. The purpose of the fee, he explained, was really intended to motivate students to write. If they feel obligated to pay, he grinned, tapping his forehead, and they feel obligated to write. No one from the Manhattan Mercury wrote a featured article about him, just the usual small typical announcement of his death, as if he hadn't worked for the newspaper, as if his voice had never existed. Part of the problem came from an old petty dispute with an editor about an article he wrote concerning the definition of rape, whether it was a violent crime or a sexual one. I remembered he once warned me about the pettiness of people in the writing world. I'm honored to say I knew a great writer and a teacher of writing. As inscribed in one of his preferences, I believe that if a writer can return to the world more than what the world has given him, then he has earned his keep, not only as a writer, but also a human being. I also believe that whatever saves my life must be good. I have lived a God-blessed life, and I want to pass it on. Okay, Leonard, here's the $1 I owe you. I always pay my debts.
How do you know I wasn't using my cane? And that remark was unnecessary. I'm not a schoolboy.
That's exactly what you are until you finish your therapy.
The only therapy I need is getting to Seattle to see Dr. Sakama.
Sam, how many operations have you been through already?
Start that again. Don't start it!
Don't pin your hopes on Dr. Sakama.
I'm not going to live like this for the rest of my life. I'm going to see